ISO. Let's answer a couple questions about ISO. What exactly is ISO? How does ISO affect exposure? How does ISO affect the quality of photos, and which ISO and when? So whether we call it ISO or ISO, we're going to discuss this a little bit more detail so you know how to use this in your camera for your photos. Let's start with the question, what exactly is ISO? So ISO is one of the three factors when determining the exposure of photo. So it works alongside of aperture and shutter speed, which we'll discuss much more detail in future weeks. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and it's a rating. So ISO ratings measure light sensitivity for an image sensor. In the old days, we had our old cameras, our old film cameras. We could only change the ISO by changing the roll of film. And you might remember on rolls of film, it had ISO and a number. And it talked about, use this film for action, use this film for dark, use this film for outside. So that's where we got this ISO from. So now ISO, it really determines the sensitivity of that sensor in your specific camera, and it then affects the exposure of the photos. Now remember, every camera is different. The actual sensitivity of the sensor can't be changed. So when I'm changing my ISO, I'm not making my actual sensor more sensitive. It's just producing different or higher ISO ratings then gives a signal to amplify pixels. So it's a signal from the pixels that they must be amplified. And that amplification allows the pixels to see better under low light, adding electronic gain to the signal. And this in turn bumps up the pixel's response to low light. And so that's why when we get a really high ISO, we see more noise. We see those what we call artifacts in the darker image areas. So our scale for ISO typically starts around 100. And that scale continues to double to whatever your camera's capability is. As that ISO rating doubles, that light sensitivity of the image sensor also doubles, or it can be considered, twice as fast. So when we look at our scale, typically we have 100, double that we get 200, double that we get 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. Some cameras offer an ISO boost or an ISO expansion. And in those, you could get a potential of 25,000 for your ISO, which is pretty much insane. Pretty much seeing in dark what nobody else could ever see. Most point-and-shoot cameras have settings that range from 100, 200 to 1600. So to take the cleanest image with the least amount of noise, it's recommended to use the lowest ISO that your camera is capable of. If you are not able to get a fast enough shutter speed with that low ISO setting under the lighting conditions, then try using a tripod or choosing a larger aperture, or as a last resort, then increasing the ISO. Next question. How does ISO affect exposure? So like we mentioned, ISO is one of the three determining factors of exposure of a photo. So along with ISO, we look at aperture and we look at shutter speed. So ISO affects that sensor. Just think of ISO as connected directly to that sensor, and it determines how well exposed a photo will be by changing that pixel sensitivity. So like we mentioned, ISO is doubled. When we double ISO, the exposure is doubled. They're proportional to one another. So low ISO, low exposure. High ISO, high exposure. Let's take a look at some examples, and I think this will help. These examples come from a website called expertphotography.com. So here's an example where the ISO is set at 100. You can see that our environment, we're shooting outside. Here's the ISO at 200. Here's the ISO at 400. Here's the ISO at 800. Here's the ISO at 1600. ISO at 3200. So can you see how that changed? Let's just go through those one more time. 3200, 1600, 800. This is probably the ideal exposure. 400, 200, and 100. Ideal right there. So you can see how that ISO really does affect the exposure. So now how does that ISO affect the quality of the photos? We just saw some. General rule, like we mentioned, the lower the number, the better the quality of the photo. Doubling the ISO doubles the exposure. That also doubles the digital noise. And so that's the key thing here. When we get high ISOs, we get noise, we get digital noise, and that reduces the detail of the photo. It makes the image appear grainy, looks like grain. So the lower number that ISO is, lower the sensitivity, but we get higher quality photos. So, examples, the photographer, can change that shutter speed and the aperture along with the ISO. And so, we don't just have one variable here. Sometimes we're dealing with a different shutter speed and a different aperture. So if you find that a shutter speed at a given ISO is too slow, then you want to choose a wider lens aperture or use a tripod. If you don't have a tripod, it's always a good idea to stabilize your camera by resting it on a table, roof of the car, tree stump, branch, a wall, or something that you can anchor yourself to. So if we look at these examples here, like I mentioned, we have other variables, and so it's not just the ISO that's being changed, but you can look at the quality. Just look at the quality here. So here's an ISO at 100. Here's an ISO at 200, not a whole lot of difference. ISO at 400, if you look in the darker areas, you start seeing some more noise. Here's 800, and here's 600. Can you see the quality is degrading? And here's at 3200. So when we're zoomed in here at this very high ISO, you can see that we're getting much stronger noise. Now all cameras are different. And the noise issue used to be much more of a problem in older cameras, even older SLR cameras. Today's cameras can handle this a bit better. There's compensations that happen. And so in a brand new high-end camera today, you can shoot at higher ISOs without the issue of the graininess and the noise, I guess without it being as big of an issue, I should say. So how do I know then which ISO to choose, and when should I choose that specific number? Again, it's a lot of trial and error, as is most all photography is trial and error. See what works, see what doesn't work, remember what works. So when we're looking at ISOs, we said low number is better. We get the best detail, we get the best quality. So ISOs 100 to 200 is what you'd want to be at if you're shooting outside in the daylight. If you are outside but in shade, then you would probably look at an ISO 200 to 400. Or if you're indoors that's very brightly lit, you could do the 200 to 400. If you're indoors and you're using a flash, the lighting isn't as good, 400 to 800. And then when you get to the 800s and on up, you start talking about what we call event photographers, people who are shooting at like concerts, night gigs, those kind of things. We start getting into that. So when there's no flash allowed, then you you have to increase that ISO. So 800 to 1600, again, indoor events, concerts, 16 to 3200 is really low light conditions. And again, if it's low light, you don't have a tripod because you're not able to, hold that shot steady. 3200 plus low light conditions with artistic effect, and it's impossible to avoid the grain when you're getting over 3200. So higher ISO for low light, fast capture. The low light, it reacts, if you want to react fast to changing conditions or capture motion, again, you'd go for that higher ISO. A lot of cameras have an auto ISO where the camera will adjust the ISO as the lighting levels change. So you might want to look to see if your camera has that. Although this is nice to control. So here's an example of an outdoor. We're talking 100 to 200. This works perfect. If we look at a night shooting fireworks, a concert, then we're looking at 16 above. Again, extreme low light conditions. If you don't have a tripod, because you're going to get a little bit of jitter if you're trying to shoot a different ISO with handheld. So there are some ideas for you on what you should be shooting at for the ISO. What exactly is ISO? How does it affect the exposure? How does ISO affect the quality? And which ISO should you choose and when? So hopefully this answers some of your questions. The sources for this, again, a really great site, expertphotography.com by Joshua Dunlap, and then the textbook, Real World Digital Photography, which is a really great book if you're interested, coming from Chapter 2, How a Digital Camera Works.